Canada's role in world affairs has often relied on the power of persuasion rather than on might or even economic heft. And in an era where digital technology is fundamentally changing our understanding of what power on the international stage means, the pathways of influence are changing. Can Canada keep its standing in the world? Let's ask UBC professor Taylor Owen, co-editor of The World Won't Wait, Why Canada Needs to Rethink Its Foreign Policies. He's also the author of Disruptive Power, The Crisis of the State in the Digital Age. And Taylor Owen, we're delighted to welcome you here to TVL.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Let's do an excerpt, first of all, from Book One, which you co-edited with Roland Paris, who's been a frequent guest on this program in the past. Here's from The World Won't Wait. Canada needs a more ambitious, forward-looking, and effective international strategy. Profound global changes are casting doubt on assumptions that have long underpinned Canada's foreign policy. No longer can the United States be relied upon either to drive Canadian economic growth or to single-handedly underwrite the global trading system and international security. Competition for markets, energy, and resources is intensifying. Communications technologies are collapsing distance and hierarchies, empowering new digital actors, but also raising new concerns about intrusive surveillance, cyber attacks, and violent radicalization across borders. Rising powers and non-state actors, from philanthropic foundations to terrorist networks, are playing a larger role on the global stage. Okay, Taylor, lots to unpack there, so let's start doing that. The traditional assumptions that you say Canadians need to put aside, they are what, for example?
Well, at the core, I think it's the post-World War II liberal internationalist order in which we have both been a successful actor, a prominent actor, probably more prominent than our size and overall influence.
And when you say liberal, you mean small L liberal?
Small L liberal international order, the liberal international institutions that were built after the Second World War. The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods organizations, which were at the core built to ensure, both provide security of individuals that we felt were too vulnerable in sort of in a more anarchistic world pre these institutions, but also to protect individual rights and freedoms. So they became the vehicles through which we promoted our values and in many cases our interests.
Do we need to discard them now?
I think in many cases we do, yeah. I mean,
which ones do you want to get rid of?
Well, I think the idea that we are going to leave this amount of our foreign policy to these institutions or devolve them to these institutions is probably troublesome. And I would say that because these institutions are all state-based at their core. The core membership of them are driven by governments, the leaderships are by governments, and nations play the primary role in delivering all the services these institutions provide. And I would argue that in this current international order, and increasingly so, the state is an increasingly marginalized actor in the international system.
An increasingly marginalized actor? The United States, China, India?
Yes.
Great Britain, France,
yes.
Germany, Canada, we're
yes.
going to be increasingly marginalized?
I think the state as a 20th century hierarchical bureaucratic institution is declining in its ability to control large numbers of people. It used to be that these institutions had monopolies over collective action. To make lots of people do things, you needed to have a big industrial company, a Ford, you needed to have a big broadcast media company, or you needed to have a national government that could tax and regulate and make lots of people do things. So that was the institutional structure through which we promoted our interests and our values in the international system. Now, like you read in that intro, I believe there's multiple layers of actors, and increasingly actors who are fundamentally technologically enabled, who are now able to be vehicles of collective action, make lots of people do things, and have significant impact in the international system. And so I'm not saying that states aren't important or aren't still powerful. In fact, in some cases, some states are much more powerful than they were before. But what I am saying is that I think the overall trajectory is that we can't count on these formal 20th century institutions to deliver the type of control they used to be able to deliver.
I hear you, but I could understand those plus as opposed to whatever the new thing is and discard the past.
Well, I'm not saying discard the past. I'm saying the role of the state in this international system will, I think, have to change.
But does that mean Canada gets out of NATO?
No, probably not. But I think we're already seeing the role of NATO change quite dramatically, given its inability to project force and control the areas on its periphery, for example, right? I mean, the idea that NATO will be the one and only vehicle through which we'll provide peace and security for a big chunk of the world, I think is no longer a
Right.
reality.
We're not worried about NATO being there so the Soviet tanks, when they roll through Germany to the west, won't get us.
Exactly.
We don't need them for that anymore.
Right.
What do we do? What do we need them for now?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think and it's a tough question. I think there have been cases where NATO has proven a very good vehicle for providing a degree of legitimacy for certain actions that couldn't be implemented through the United Nations. So to a
Bombing
wider,
Serbia, for example.
Sure. I mean, and there it was primarily a military alliance amongst a relatively few number of countries, but it did provide a certain level of legitimacy that they couldn't get in the UN. So, like, certainly things like that are possible, but I actually think the idea of Western alliance, military alliances, probably is in decline.
Can you tell us how involved Justin Trudeau will be in crafting Canada's forward-looking 21st century foreign policy?
My guess would be, then certainly my view, watching it from a distance, has been that the currency of Justin Trudeau on the international stage, it surpasses even his most ardent fans.
How so?
Just take his role at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Here was someone who walked in and for 4 or 5 days got into every meeting he wanted to be in, was the center of attention in this very powerful group of corporate leaders and political leaders, and tried to leverage that into meaningful, soft Canadian power.
Successfully? Successfully?
I don't think we know yet. I mean, I think a lot of these reflections on a government's foreign policy, we need to give a little bit of time. I mean, so I would say that's one big thing, that the currency of Justin Trudeau is going to be really interesting to see how that gets leveraged in the international system. In the UN is another place where it could be incredibly valuable. Already there's been a significant amount of dialogue at the UN that wouldn't have happened probably in the last 20 years of Canadian foreign policy. So that I think is really important. But the other big piece of this is they are now having to implement some of the foreign policy-based election promises that were made that have, and I would say the points where they've had the most trouble are those particular promises that were made during the election that they're now having to implement quite quickly. Changing policies in Syria, the review of C-51, the Saudi arms deal. I mean, these are all things that they are doing what they said they were going to do.
On the F-35 issue, they said they were going to open up to tender and completely open, transparent process on those new fighter jets, and now they're saying, maybe not. Probably not, actually.
It looks like it. I mean, I just know what I've read on that, and it looks like they're going to move. I don't know. Problematic in what regard? Politically, strategically?
How about actually? Let's keep the politics out of
Yeah.
it. How about whatever it is that we need in terms of a fighter jet for the 21st century? They said before we were going to open it up to tender and let everybody bid on it. Now they're saying they're basically going to do the same thing the Conservatives did.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a pretty big flip-flop.
With a different purchase, with a different piece of equipment that they're buying, that one could make the case is more strategically aligned to at least our short-term interest with these. I mean, my personal view is that the idea of manned fifth-generation fighters is probably a little bit archaic in a view of automated violence and drones and where I think the future of war is going.
Do you yet have a gauge on whether or not Justin Trudeau is intellectually up to, personally interested in, personally committed to the issues that you've raised in your book?
I don't know. My sense, from viewing this again from afar and from engaging with the National Security Review that the Defense Minister is running, with the National Development Review that Global Affairs is running, that there is a real seriousness in both engaging on foreign policy and rethinking some of the core principles of Canadian foreign policy. And a real recognition that the nature of conflict, the nature of multilateralism, the nature of international crime and criminal networks is fundamentally changing.
How would you describe the difference between a Stephen Harper-focused foreign policy and a Justin Trudeau-focused foreign policy?
That's an interesting question. I think Stephen Harper was focused on a discrete, like with most things, with a narrow list of things he thought were critically important. I think my sense is that this Liberal government, in all sorts of areas, not just foreign policy, wants to do a lot more than that. They want to, and their list of their platform is a great example of that. 200 and something positions,
Yep.
all of which are complex in their own way. So, and that's true of foreign policy as well. The big question is, I think, is whether there will actually be a fundamental rethinking of our place in, like, what does it mean to be a G7, G8 country in a very privileged spot, in a very privileged club, when if what I am saying is even remotely true, the nature of power is decentralizing in some important ways. What is the role of the state in that system? What is the role of the state in reforming international institutions that used to be fundamentally state-based, but now probably need to be more dynamic? And I'm not sure we know the answer to that.
Well, you raised the issue of power, and we had Moises Naim on the program not too long ago, author of The End of Power.
Yeah.
He wrote that, quote, power is easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. That suggests a very unstable world going forward. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Yes. I do, fundamentally.
What are we to make of that kind of world that we're about to embark into?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I think it really does put, not to dwell on this, but the structures of governments and the structures of large industrial institutions in a really awkward spot. They used to be able to control things they didn't like. The problem now is both they don't have this monopoly of being able to control things. There's more people with more control in this messy international environment. But even worse, the things that they have to do to control actors who are empowered in this new messy system, so say actors like people who are using Bitcoin to run criminal networks or to trade, to either avoid taxes or to run online drug markets, right? That would be perceived as a government as a negative actor that they have a responsibility to counter.
Now they can't do anything about it.
Well, they can do something about it.
Like what?
They can increase their efforts to break encryption, for example. They could further expand surveillance capacities and make them more aggressive. But the things they could do more points of collection of data on our global internet. The things I would argue that they have to do, though, and this is the problem I think in this ecosystem, is that the things they would have to do to stop these perceived negative actors also would stop what we think is all the positive online activity. The very same thing that empowers those Bitcoin black market operators also empowers the activist who wants to hide from the Syrian surveillance of the Syrian government. And that puts, I think, governments in a really tough spot in this system.
Well, okay, a tough spot is one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is they're utterly powerless to do anything about anything that's happening in the world today.
I mean, that's why I called it a crisis in that book. I legitimately think it's a crisis of state power. Now, there are certain, we've seen in many ways how they've chosen to react in this, how many governments have chosen to react. I think they've chosen to seek control over this system, over this new digital architecture, through massive surveillance efforts to, as the Five Eyes network says, collect it all, process it all, analyze it all, know it all, to collect as much of the internet as they can with the hope that that will somehow give them an advantage. And I think we've seen quite clearly that it doesn't. Autocratic governments have sought to actually shut down the internet, to have their own internets. The Chinese government, the Iranian government, the Russian government have all sought to completely control this ecosystem in an explicit, not just an implicit way. So I think we're starting to see just how threatened governments are by this empowerment, but also how they're willing to respond. And to me, that's a core foreign policy challenge.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this.
Yeah.
Do you see a world going forward where the number of jets and tanks and nukes and military hardware that you have will be far less important to the impact you can have on the world stage than all of these other sort of intelligence gathering and far more sort of cyber-spatially focused things that you've just mentioned?
Well, I think there's been a tendency in the way we talk about the deployment of force to separate the two, to say that we will have fighters and weapons and guns on one side, or increasingly drones, and we will have large-scale surveillance efforts and intelligence operations on the other. The reality is that increasingly, and already, the weapons that we deploy and we will increasingly deploy in the future are all built on this data architecture. They're increasingly driven by large data flows and with algorithms making decisions about who to target, who to select, where the needle in this haystack is that should be targeted, and increasingly who and when to kill. And so these things, they're symbiotic. We're getting an evolution of this large data system that's being largely controlled by a few corporations and a few governments, and what I would argue is a very rapid expansion of automated violent capability. And that's something I think we need to be thinking very seriously about.
Okay, but we can't do it all. We can't have the biggest military that some people would like to have, nor are we going to be ever as sophisticated as the National Security Agency in the United States. So if you have a finite amount of dollars to spend on a finite number of things, where do you put the priority?
In terms of military or foreign policy generally?
Foreign policy in general.
Well, I mean, I would make the case that there are an increasing number of ungoverned spaces in the international system, whether it be these sorts of cryptocurrencies, whether it be the use of algorithms to make policing and governance and violent decisions that sit totally outside of our mechanisms of accountability.
So we got to get good at that.
I think we could be a leader in figuring out how to get good at that. If we want to have a role in these evolving international institutions and try and insert some relevance back into them, I think some questions like that would be strategic to focus on. What are the new ungoverned spaces? What are the new weapon systems that we think maybe the world should be talking about how to regulate and control? How are we going to talk about data sharing across an increasing network of countries sharing data? Should we be sharing data across countries? We share a huge amount of data with 4 other countries in the world, including, we learned recently, by mistake, years of data about all the internet communication of Canadians. So should we be a part of that network? I think those are some if we were serious about having an impact and engaging in the way we have in the world before in this new ecosystem, those are the types of things I would be trying to get at.
There is a new law in every country in the world now, and that is that when everybody does an interview, they have to ask about Donald Trump. So here comes the Trump question, and that is, I mean, we're months away from Election Day in the United States, so who knows? But if he wins, the decoupling that you're talking about, does that get hastened?
Well, I mean, there'll be a wall separating us, so that will physically
Wait
be
a second, I thought the wall was between U.S. and Mexico.
But that's just I mean, my feeling is that Trump is sort of the expression of nihilistic views of government. That there's a lot of people in the United States who just want to burn the house down. And I would say there's also a lot of people in Canada who want to as well. This city elected Rob Ford. 57% of the people elected Rob Ford. Most of those same people, or a big majority of the ridings that elected Rob Ford, also elected a Liberal government. So I think there's a federal Liberal government. I think there's a huge swing potential of people to be fed up with the inability of government to deliver on the things they're promising to do. And that to me is a function of their increasing inability to actually, as I said, control lots of people, deliver services in an industrial scale like they did before. And in the US, a manifestation of that is someone who just says to burn the house down.
Let's ask about the other neighbor as well. We've talked about the states. Russia. How would you suggest we handle our relationship with them going forward?
My general sense is it is another symptom of declining 20th century powers, and they're lashing out. And do we want to get in the way of that lashing out? Is it in our interest to get in the way of that lashing out? What are things we can do on the periphery of that to possibly assist allies and to engage potentially even in the digital space? There's some interesting things going on in Ukraine around protecting citizens, and so there's some potential there, but my bias would be more aligned with where I think President Obama's been on this, which is it's best not to poke a flailing
angry Russian
lion.
bear.
Yeah.
Let's finish on this. I suspect for many Canadians, they view, to the extent they ever think about foreign policy, they see us as kind of an honest broker in the world, middle power, clearly, but one that hopefully punches above its weight every now and then, tries to find consensus among squabbling neighbors, all of that kind of thing. How does that notion of our role in the world get accommodated with the changes that you're envisioning?
Well, I think it means thinking carefully about what was our added value in previous conversations and previous efforts? What were we bringing to the international conversation that other countries either didn't or wouldn't or couldn't? And to me, that's probably some of the things you said, some sort of promotion of broadly defined liberal norms and ethics in the international system, some sort of sense of individual protection and security in the international system. What does that look like in a world where our primary vehicle for implementing it isn't the same institutions in which we had influence? What's the new architecture for that? To me, that's the big ambitious question. What does the new international architecture look like? One that both includes nation states, but also includes a whole host of actors that in our institutions are utterly marginalized at the moment.
So we should have a view on that and then try to implement it.
That's my belief, yeah.
Do we have a view on it yet?
Not that I know of.
Well, if people want to know more about that view, that at the moment you say is not infecting our foreign policy establishment, The World Won't Wait, Why Canada Needs to Rethink Its International Policies. That's one. You're a busy guy, Taylor Owen, because there's another one as well, Disruptive Power, The Crisis of the State in the Digital Age, a second book that you've got out right now. Taylor Owen, UBC professor, thanks for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.